The apex of APS-C mirrorless zooms, the Sigma 70-40mm f1.8 ART, is now available for Canon RF mount and has received much fanfare and praise from reviewers. This lens is not the first of its kind, however. Its predecessor, 2013's Sigma 18-35mm f1.8 ART, is still readily available for Canon's EF mount and still readily usable on modern RF bodies through an adapter. With a used copy going for $400 or $500, the 18-35 can be acquired for quite a bit less than its successor, which, as of September 2025, retails for around double at $919. Is the new lens worth the extra investment, and are there situations where the older one might even be preferable? Today, we'll conduct a series of tests directly comparing the two on a modern Canon APS-C body and see if we can find some answers. As always, if you want to skip straight to certain tests or conclusions, see the chapter bar below or consult the timestamps in the description. Before we dive in, note that I'll only be testing these lenses on APS-C bodies, and this video assumes you are familiar with the basic lens specifications that you can find online or in dedicated reviews. I'll only be directly comparing these two lenses, but if you're curious how it compares to a few different lenses, I do have another video comparing the 18-35 to a few primes and the RFS kit lenses. Spoiler alert, the 17-40 and 18-35 perform similarly optically, so you can get an idea of how much the new lens also compares to those. Also, as a disclaimer, I purchased both of these lenses with my own money and am not being sponsored by Sigma, Canon, or any other company, and largely conducted these tests to satisfy my own curiosity. Let's start with a physical comparison between the two. Both have a very good build quality and feel similar in hand. The 17-40 has a bit more plastic in its external construction, but still doesn't feel cheap. Surprisingly, the 18-35 does not have any weather sealing, while the newer lens is dust and splash resistant, according to Sigma. Both are internally zooming and can be used to zoom on a gimbal without having to rebalance. Volume-wise, they also initially seem similar, but the addition of the required EF to RF adapter lengthens the 18-35mm a bit more. Looking at the front glass, you can see the 17-40mm is a bit thinner as well, which is reflected in the smaller filter size of 67 versus the 72mm of the 18-35. The included hoods look extremely similar and are both awkward twist-ons, though the 17-40's is a bit easier and now includes a release button. Once in the hand though, we'll experience a major difference, the weight. At 560 grams, or about 20 ounces, the 17-40mm is 250 grams lighter than its predecessor, which might not seem like that much, but the mandatory EF to RF adapter adds another 110 grams to the 18-35, bringing its total weight to 920 grams, or a little over 32 ounces. It's hard to convey through video the difference this makes, but it's enough of one that in my experience the 17-40mm is much more comfortable to use as a walk-around lens. It's also less front heavy, which will greatly benefit lighter bodies such as the R50 and R100, and of course make gimbal use easier. Back to the lens bodies, both have a dedicated focus switch that behaves similarly. The zoom rings feel similar to turn, though the 17-40 does take noticeably longer to zoom the full extent, and is slightly quieter when it hits the maximum. Importantly, the 18-35 zooms out counterclockwise, the opposite direction than the 17-40mm and Canon lenses do. The manual focus ring is smooth and quiet for both, though the newer lens is a tad smoother and quieter still, and both focus further by rotating counterclockwise, in line with Canon's own lenses. The 18-35 uses a mechanical focus system, however, meaning it can focus even when the lens is not powered, and bears a focus scale on that lens body. The 17-40 in contrast lacks such a scale, and uses an electronic fly-by-wire system instead. Which one is preferable depends on the user's tastes, but the 17-40mm is also compatible with Canon's electronic full-time manual focus features, allowing for one-shot autofocus peaking and magnification, as well as changing the focus ring rotation direction and the way it behaves with rotation speed and degree. Back to the lens body, the newer 17-40 has an additional customizable and unmarked control ring close to the lens mount. On the Canon version of this lens, this ring unfortunately cannot be declicked, and the noise may be audible in your video footage. Your mileage may vary whether you find Canon's control rings useful or not, but if you do find them useful, the 18-35 need not be left out, as Canon offers an EF to RF adapter with one built in. Speaking of adapters, you can also buy ones with drop-in filters or speed boosting capabilities, which I have no experience with, but many people seem to love using. Being specifically made for mirrorless cameras, the 17-40mm of course cannot use such adapters. And finally, the 17-40 has two AF stop buttons, both of which are linked to the LFN function in Canon's menus and can be customized for quite a few different functions. Again, your mileage may vary on whether these are useful, but if your camera body is starved of buttons, the more you can get the better. Sigma has improved the zoom range on this new lens, both far and wide. How much of a difference does this actually make in practice? In the following scene, the camera was mounted to a tripod and never moved, so the slight perspective changes you see are due to the differing lens dimensions. The extra range of the new lens is certainly noticeable when seen side by side, but it's not enough to open up new genres. For reference, here are the two compared to the Canon EFS 15-85mm. Both lenses have similar minimum focus distances, or MFD, of 28 centimeters, nearly a foot. Since MFD is calculated from the sensor instead of the front element, this means the older and longer 18-35mm at 35mm can autofocus on an object about 10 centimeters from the glass, versus around 13 centimeters for the 17-40 at 40mm. As a result, the older 18-35mm can provide more magnification, though neither lens is impressive in this regard. If you're a fan of high burst rate shooting, the older 18-35 does seem to have a limit of how many photos it can take per second. Even this R10 with its relatively modest 15 frames a second in electronic first curtain mode is much slower than the 17-40mm. While the hypersonic motor, or HSM autofocus driver of the 18-35 is competent enough for photos and is fairly quick and smooth for videos, it is loud, offering up a sound akin to a Geiger counter for the quieter scenes in your footage. The 17-40 autofocus is dead quiet in comparison, and as a bonus, focuses smoother and faster as well. In addition, the 17-40 is compatible with Canon's digital focus distance scale, which in my opinion is more useful than the analog one of the 18-35. Both lenses unfortunately do not cover the full sensor area when it comes to autofocus, which can cause problems with tracking rapidly moving subjects or attempting to focus on objects in the edge of your frame. Focus breathing, the phenomenon where the field of view changes as the focusing plane does, can ruin video footage, as seen here from the EFS 15-85mm. Will one or both of these Sigmas suffer as well? As far as I could tell, both lenses perform very well in this particular scene. while neither lens is claimed to be parfocal or keeping their focus on the initial object while zooming. How badly do these two shift? In this test, the R10 was focused on at f1.8 at the maximum zoom extent to see how far the focus would shift when zoomed out. Neither were too bad, but the 18-35 was noticeably more out of focus. The 17-40mm also works with Canon's real-time depth of field simulation feature, which can save you a lot of time or guesswork in photography modes. The 18-35 in contrast is always wide open in photo mode, and requires pressing the depth of field preview button instead if you stop the aperture down. Speaking of which, changing the aperture is surprisingly noisy on the 18-35, and is accompanied by flashes of white and black. This behavior is certainly not ideal for video and is absent on the new 17-40. Neither lens features stabilization, but if you own the R7 or any other future APS-C body with IBIS or in-body image stabilization, you may be wondering how they interact with these third-party lenses. Unfortunately, as of the making of this video, the 17-40mm does not function properly with the R7's IBIS. However, Sigma is aware of the issue and hopefully will issue a firmware update in the near future. The older 18-35mm does smooth jitters nicely on the R7, but only if the firmware is updated. If you purchase a used copy that isn't, you'll need a USB dock from Sigma to do so, adding another $25 to $50 to the lens's cost. How do you know if this needs doing, since you can't check the firmware either without the dock? If in-camera corrections are not available, then you know your 18-35mm is on the base firmware version 1.0. Speaking of in-camera corrections, both lenses do offer them, though distortion correction is disabled on the 17-40mm. I believe this may actually be because it's always active, since if you compare an out-of-camera JPEG shot with the lens to a RAW image on software that cannot interpret CR3 files, you will see dramatic barrel distortion on the wide end. All possible in-camera corrections will be enabled for the upcoming image quality test, which will compare JPEGs converted from full RAW and Canon's digital photo professional software with no editing done. I attempted to replicate the scene here equally with a variety of focal lengths from 17mm to 40mm. However, due to the length differences between the two lenses, there may be some slight perspective changes. All images were taken with the 32-megapixel Canon EOS R7 at ISO 100 and auto shutter speed to match exposure. A tripod, electronic shutter, and remote shooting was used to eliminate human and shutter shake, and the camera's in-body stabilization was turned off as well. One-shot spot focus was used consistently and aimed at the red pepper stem for each photo. White balance was set to 2800K, and picture style was set to standard. For each photo, we'll be comparing the full extent, a 1080p crop of the center, and a 1080p crop of the lower right corner. Now we'll discuss what we just saw. Bear in mind this is just my own observations and opinions, and you may have differing one based on what you see. Overall, the two lenses are of similar sharpness centrally and similar color rendition, though the 17 to 40mm does seem to have a slight edge in contrast. At 17 and 18mm, the 17 to 40 is noticeably softer than the 18 to 35 in the corners, until around f2.8, at which point the newer lens catches up or even exceeds the older. At 24, 35, and 40mm, the 17 to 40's corners are even softer and don't catch up until f8. The 17 to 40 does have a central sharpness advantage, wide open at 35 and 40mm at least, but unlike the corners, that is not really noticeable unless you crop in. How about the background blur? In this comparison, we're focusing on a lens hood about 30 centimeters from the photographing camera's lens mount. The hood is 80 centimeters in front of a small Christmas tree with tiny LED lights. At 17 and 18mm, the two lenses produce extremely similar bokeh, though the light spears are slightly more angled on the 18 to 35 when stopped down, likely due to that lens's 9 diaphragm blades versus the 11 of the 17 to 40mm. At 35 and 40mm, the 17 to 40 produces pronounced cat eye effects at f1.8 and f2, which rounds out by f2.8. Aside from this and the slightly more angular spears of the 18 to 35, the images are extremely similar. How attractive are these backgrounds in the real world? And how do they compare to a random prime, such as this RF 24mm f1.8? At shared settings, the 17 to 40's light spears are noticeably sharper, which gives the entire scene a busier look than the other two. The RF 24mm light spears are softer, but are plagued with highlight fringing. The 18 to 35 is the most pleasing of the three in my opinion, at least in this random scene. Having used the 18 to 35 for over a year, the susceptibility to flaring is one weakness of this lens I was hoping the successor would solve, which Sigma claims to have done. Does this actually bear out in reality? Let's test both f1.8 and f10 at minimum and maximum focal lengths of each lens and see how they perform. Note that the lens hood is on for both. my eye, the 17 to 40mm does indeed have reduced flare artifacting and contrast loss compared to the original, though it still suffers from both. Both lenses are known to suffer from color fringing, or longitudinal chromatic aberration, at bright apertures, but has Sigma managed to tame this somewhat on the 17 to 40. I'll be testing at near both lenses' minimum focus distances, and note that due to the varying lens dimensions, I was unable to perfectly match perspective. The newer lens seems to perform a bit worse here, perhaps due to the increased central sharpness and contrast. Fringing on both lenses is much reduced by f5.6 and nearly gone by f8. With a 12-year gap between the two lenses, one would expect the newer model to improve on just about every aspect of the original, and for the most part, that is exactly what the Sigma 17 to 40mm f1.8 ART lens does. But are those improvements worth an extra $400 or $500 over the Sigma 18 to 35mm, especially when the image quality is so similar? Only you can truly answer that question for yourself, but I'll give my own opinions and recommendations. First off, if you already own the 18 to 35 and are wondering whether to upgrade to the 17 to 40, I would only consider doing so if you shoot a lot of video and/or find the weight unbearable. If you don't own the 18 to 35 and don't want to buy a used lens, then definitely go for the 70 to 40, as the 18 to 35 is currently overpriced new, at least in the United States. If you're a video or hybrid shooter who films handheld or on a gimbal, the 17 to 40 is definitely worth it, though you may want to wait for a firmware update if you're a handheld ART7 user. Tripod video users who don't intend to do much subject tracking or rapid setting changes may wish to save money using the 18 to 35mm, however. If you're mostly a photographer who does not mind the weight or bulk, the 18 to 35 again may be a more favorable option, especially given its sharper corners and softer bokeh. You might be attracted to the increased focal range as well, but in practice, it's more an icing on the cake situation than an actual game changer, especially considering the increased minimum focus distance. If you're a photographer looking for a walk-around lens, though, the weight and bulk reduction of the 17 to 40mm make it much more comfortable and fun to use, as does the compatibility with the depth of field simulation. I hope you found all or part of this comparison useful, and it answered a few questions you may have had. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment, and/or subscribe.